Hello, my name is David Turner and this is the 5th Lunar Poetry Podcast, and this month I'm in Ely and I'm joined by Elaine, Ewart and Leanne Moden, both former Fenland Poet Laureates, and Poppy Kleiser, the current Fenland Poet Laureate. And as usual, my guests will begin with giving us a short introduction to themselves. Maybe we'll start with Leanne.
Okay, my name's Leanne Moden. I was the Fenland Poet Laureate in 2013, and now I co-organise and run the Fenland Poet Laureate competition, co-run the Fen Speak open mic nights in the Fens, and just generally push poetry as much as I can.
Great. And Elaine?
My name's Elaine Ewart. I was the first Fenland Poet Laureate in 2012. I am a poet and, I suppose, broadly speaking, nature writer, and I, along with Leanne, currently co-organise the Fenland Poet Laureate Awards and co-organised the monthly open mic nights, Fen Speak.
And Poppy.
My name's Poppy Kleiser and I'm the current Fenland Poet Laureate, but only for 2 more months. We're getting ready to judge the next competition next month, and I live in the Fens, so I generally write all about the Fens and its mysteries and wildness.
Yeah, so regarding the Poet Laureate title, we're going to come to that towards the end. So I think just because of the location, and I think the Fens are obviously going to be a focus of the conversation today. I just wondered if we could give the listeners a brief geographical description of the area and its boundaries, just so we could set the scene a little bit, so people might not know what Fenland is. Or...
Sure. So the Fens is a portion of Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire and Norfolk.
Suffolk as well.
And a little bit of Suffolk, yes. So, and it's a flat marshy area that was reclaimed from the sea, so it's got a beautiful romantic history to it. And it's sort of north of Cambridge and sort of west of King's Lynn and south of Spalding, so... Yeah. That's kind of the general.
South of Spalding, that's a niche description.
Yes, sorry about that.
It is slightly complicated.
Yeah, but I think actually that's the idea of giving a description as to what the Fens are, because it is quite... When you try to explain to people, it's just that bit, it's not... Yeah. It's a bit... I don't want to belittle it, say it's just that bit in the middle, but it's, strictly speaking, it is the bit between everything else, isn't it? And it's huge, isn't it?
It's an incredibly rural area and it's very, very, very flat.
It's weird, you definitely know, as soon as you've left King's Lynn, the other side of it gets so much hillier, and it's like you just know you're not in the Fens anymore.
But I noticed that again today, coming up on the train, I can't remember what point it is, but it's around Water Beach and the soil gets much blacker.
Oh, it's
yeah. Okay, so between the three of you, could you give us some sort of description of what Fen poetry is? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to agree on this, I mean if it's three descriptions that's fine, but just some idea of what you believe that Fen poetry is.
Well, I think it's really a very broad thing. It's really, I think, poetry that's so strongly associated with the place that you're in and your relationship to the land and to its history and its people. I don't think we should be really prescriptive about what it is.
Definitely, I think with the Fen Speak open mic nights, what we're trying to do is encourage people who live in the Fens to engage in poetry in whichever way they wish to. So whether that's sort of spoken word performance stuff about, I don't know, biscuits or anything like that, or things that are very tightly, tied into the land and the landscape. Anything goes, really. It's just helping people in an area that doesn't have a lot of arts funding and doesn't have a lot of facilities for the arts to engage with poetry, I think.
Okay.
I mean, I've always written sort of around the landscape anyway, so I've sort of been very close to that. And when I came to Fenland, I thought it was different to what I was used to living in the city. It was desolate and kind of isolated and eerie in a way, but that is inspirational, and it definitely was to me. But then when you find a hub of people that that are doing the same things as you. It's really nice to be able to find that in such a desolate place and engage with people. So that was really nice.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose a follow-up question to that would be, if I understand the point about maybe trying to encourage people in this area to just engage with poetry regardless, but do you feel that there's anything happening here regarding poetry that is different to around the country? Because all three of you travel a fair bit to do readings elsewhere, don't you? I mean, is there would you say there's any difference in writing style, or is it just linked to the landscape, do you think?
That's hard. I don't know.
I think people have very different approaches. There are people who are sort of strongly influenced by sort of folk traditions, and with writing about landscape. But there are others who just write poems about just everyday things. So it's difficult to say whether there is a distinctive poetry coming from this area.
Less of a style. I mean, in London, you get quite influenced by things, I imagine, because it's surrounding you, isn't it?
Well, I was just about to make that point, actually, that it's not so much that when I say is there a particular Fen style, I didn't mean to root it too heavily in tradition. That wasn't the point. I just mean, there could be a particular take on, and you can be writing about the modern world still, but still be influenced, can't you, by tradition? That's more.
I think there's more of an influence of page poetry out here, as opposed to in a city where there's a lot of spoken word and things like that. We tend to have a lot of people who are looking at formal types of poems.
Do you think that could also come from, perhaps in the Fens you're still afforded more time to sit down and read things, whereas maybe in cities, and I don't mean it's just a typically Fen thing, maybe it's just a rural thing, but in the city maybe you don't necessarily have time to sit down, or it's harder to find time to sit down with books.
You could have always come here for peace and seclusion. That was why there's so many churches around here. All the clergy would come over here and have isolation, and so maybe it is just more of a peaceful place.
And I have certainly noticed that within our particular group there is a huge variety of styles and approaches to poetry, whereas perhaps if you go to a city and go to a slam or something like that, there seems to be more of a
fashion,
a style to it.
Yes, there's no dominant culture.
That's exactly it.
In performance.
Yeah.
And I think we're sort of we're involved in both the page poetry and the performance poetry side of things, and I think that's really a valuable sort of synergy, because the Fenland Poet Laureate Awards, you actually are judged on the page, as opposed to some local laureates which are judged in performance. But also part of what the Fenland Poet Laureate Awards do is encourage events and live poetry as well. So I think these things feed off each other.
Definitely.
Yeah. Only one of you today are actually from the Fens, which is Leanne, originally from Wisbech.
I'm from Wisbech, for my sins.
Yeah, which I know quite well because I lived for 3 years in Wisbech. I served my carpentry apprenticeship.
Oh, very good.
So hello to everyone at Castle Joinery. They're not going to be listening. And, so Poppy and Elaine are not from the Fens. Where are you from?
I'm from Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, so not too far.
And Elaine?
I'm from near Lincoln originally.
So not
very far actually.
But it is the north.
Well, let's not get into that controversy.
But since maybe this question is a bit more focused toward Poppy and Elaine at the moment, but how have the Fens influenced, if at all, your writing styles since you've been here?
Well, they definitely influenced mine a lot. I've always been into history and folk traditions of writing, But it was hard for me when I came here because, as I say, I moved from a city in Cambridge, and I felt it was very weird. The people are kind of traditional in a lot of ways. There's not much culture going on, not much funding for that. So I definitely felt isolated. But the more I read about and the more I heard about the Fens, the more I came to love it, because it's such a rebellious place.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wild in its cultivation. Its history of land rights and protest are really strong, even though we never talked about it in school. And the stories that you hear, the witch story, it's so evocative. It's just so inspiring, I think.
I guess what particularly has sort of grown on me as I've lived here is how the kind of the hiddenness of the landscape, the fact that it's got secrets you can look out across the fen, and it's as if it's concealing its stories, and you have to go and get them. And yes, it's hard to say precisely how that's affected my writing, but I suppose that's part of what I'm trying to do is uncover those stories and those moments.
That's interesting, actually, this idea of uncovering. I'm just going to refer back to November's podcast when I was interviewing Helen Moore in Sheffield, and she was talking of inspiration coming as being haunted by an idea for a poem, and just some of the ways you've described the landscape so far, and it's often described as haunting around here, especially at night and in the winter with the fog and stuff. Do you think that the Fens perhaps lends itself more to poetry, in that it's sort of a throwback to how all of rural Britain was at a time before it was over, but the Fens still retains that romanticism,
I
doesn't
think
it?
so. Yeah, definitely.
So you find it quite easy to find inspiration here in an area that most people would consider quite bleak?
Yeah, I mean, it's the bleakness that is sort of inspirational, I suppose. Yeah.
Actually, I think it's going to be a good time to go on to our first poem, which will be Poppy's poem.
Yeah.
And called?
It's called The Optimist, and this was inspired by is the land rights of the Fens, basically the Fen Tigers, and the fight that they put up to stop the Fens being drained, to keep their livelihoods, and the effect that this has had on British culture in general. And it's The Optimist. All he wanted was a little square, 3,000 feet of fertile air, and the whole of the cut-glass Fenland sky, just for a bit, until he died. The moon sang on those full-bodied nights they shared, and reeling him to hedgerows cut with swords, she said how he could change the world. For if this land was a woman, she said, you too could bear the sweetest fruits upon the earth, and know the words, this land is ours, this land is yours. All rag and bone they lay, unswept, a stinging salt-dipped itch between the land and sea. Depressed by that tsunami sky that sucks you up, you shingle left. For they have pulled the plug on life, compressed our bones with fishing nets. But the world is ripping out of its seams. The trees have had enough now, and are ripping pavements over town, and showing girls with couch-lock frowns their hunchback roots. Like zombies rising from the grave, they break their concrete chains and say, this land is ours, this land is yours. All wage and war, they cried, bereft, a herd within its grid between their land and death, but somehow less, for they have signed progression's lines and ground our bones for cattle flesh. Tired of living in a long, dark corridor, he said he longed to be outside, to feel the beating heart behind those pillared gates, reclaim the sand that give those city spires reach, for a fickle beach is this old town when money sings its pretty round. For if this city was a woman, he said, She would be mean and she'd be vain, and we would sweat and long to say, this land is ours, this land is yours.
Thank you very much. Actually, just on that last question, I was meaning to ask just a follow-up question to Elaine and Poppy. Do you think the effects that the Fens have had on your writing, do you think they will remain with you should you move to any other part of the country? Do you think it's had left an indelible mark?
I think
you?
so.
Yeah.
It's definitely makes you think deeper about a culture
Yeah.
than the way things appear, and the relationship that people have with the landscape over time, and how that changes the modern culture, I suppose, in a society.
Right, next question. So I lived in Fenland myself. I went to secondary school in Chatteris. This is like more than 15 years ago. But I thought I have a lasting memory of it, like a really strong storytelling tradition around in that area, around the villages and stuff. And while this is probably common in a lot of rural communities, I mean, I don't know, it is very strong around here, I think. Do you, as poets or writers, feel an obligation to document these stories in your poems? Do you feel like you should be retelling these in a way? Poppy?
I think poetry is very much of the people, and I think it should be. I don't think it should be something that is exclusive. And I suppose that's what we try and do as poets, is to capture the essence of a place by telling these stories of the people.
Yeah.
Yes, I think there is, as you say, a strong sort of oral tradition of storytelling, and I think I find really that the stories come and find you, that you suddenly happen upon really fascinating histories of people associated with the places, and you can't really help but write about them.
Yeah, I think Elaine's right. I think it's not so much, it doesn't feel so much as an obligation as something that comes and grabs you with both hands, and you feel like you need to
that's sort of what I was trying to get to the bottom of, is whether you feel like it's just something that you want to do, or whether you feel like you should have to do it. The next question was going to be towards the idea of, or this concept of the truth in these stories, because as stories develop anyway, besides, if we just ignore the idea of what truth is anyway, we'll be here for 2 weeks. But do you have any issue with being true to the story? Is what I mean, or do you feel like it's fair game to sort of just elaborate on top of?
I think it is a natural thing for stories to change and develop as they're retold, and it's interesting because when you have a year as Fenland Poet Laureate, people ask you to write poems for things, and sometimes this is associated with an anniversary. There was the Charles Dickens anniversary, and also Octavia Hill, the social reformer, in writing the poems, I'm often thinking, I'm not sure whether the recipient is going to actually agree that this was their message, but I think that's okay, and we all look at and get different things out of the same, what appear to be the same facts, and I think that's how it works.
It's actually the point I was sort of trying to get to, was this idea that when you are when you take a title such as Poet Laureate, or even if you're working if you're building a reputation as a poet, and somebody commissions you to write upon a certain subject, it is possible that there would be an unreasonable expectation on you to write as a historian rather than as a poet, is what I mean. So then how do you deal with that issue of wanting to be true to the poem rather than?
I think you respect what your subject is.
Yeah.
And I think if it has to be too, the person sort of listening or reading it, I think also has to kind of respect this is your take on it.
It's all a question of perspective.
It is, yes.
I think if you didn't feel something about that subject, you wouldn't write it.
Yeah.
Or you couldn't write it, I suppose. So you can always say no to things. I felt like that.
Yes,
anyway.
I don't think. Yes, it's a very difficult. The idea of writing toward or inspiration.
Sometimes it can really work, can't it? And you feel like, yes, that's really good. I can do that.
I was going to leave this question to it later on, but since we're talking about it anyway, and revisiting it, as all three of you as poet laureate, Fenland Poet Laureate, how are you expected to write poems for people? I don't even. What are your expectations as?
So basically, it's very much an open-ended position. So you are not obliged to do anything necessarily, but you can speak to local organisations and write poems for them, or write poems for events, or and we have ties with the museum in Wisbech and ADEC, the arts organisation here in Ely. So there are lots of opportunities available that come with the title in order to go to events, write poems for people, be commissioned for things, and equally, because there's no specific remit, you can say no if you want to, and that's what makes it quite a nice, flexible sort of.
Yes, there are opportunities, but not particular obligations.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Leanne and Elaine, as you mentioned in your introductions, you co-founded Fen Speak, which is a monthly open mic poetry night. Is it Fenland's only open?
It's the only regular one so far as we know.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it alternates between venues in Ely and Wisbech, and there are some special ones. I've attended one in King's Lynn just before Christmas, which is really good. And
on tour.
On tour, Fen Speak on tour.
Fen Speak on tour.
And Poppy is a regular attendee. Could you explain first why you started the night?
Okay, so it was actually my idea, for my sins again. So there are a lot of poetry open mic nights and slams and things in Cambridge and in Peterborough, but the rest of sort of Cambridgeshire, West Norfolk don't have anything like that. And I felt like there was a need there and a niche that needed to be filled. So I roped Elaine in, and we started Fen Speak, and we've got over 150 people on our Facebook page and over 60 people on our mailing list, and we regularly have about 30 to 40 people.
Yeah,
come
it was
to our
really
nights.
well attended.
So
There's
there's definitely a need there, and we feel like we've sort of been going from strength to strength, really, and it's
been really, we've been quite bowled over by how enthusiastic people have been about it, wanting to come. No shortage of people to perform.
Yes.
And people have travelled, haven't they?
They travelled
Norwich, Cambridge, Peterborough.
So.
And was it from the outset? Was it important to you that you travel from one side of the fence to the other?
Yes, definitely.
Because it's because Fenland, particularly sort of the Wisbech end, it doesn't have so much going on from sort of literary performance point of view. It was important to us that we kept both Ely and Wisbech linked together.
Our main model is sort of inclusivity, and there are a lot of people in Wisbech, because it's quite an isolated place, who aren't necessarily able to travel to Peterborough or to Cambridge or even to Ely. So we needed to be there as or to have sort of a base in each place in order to get to sort of catch all the poets and writers and storytellers who wanted to be involved. So
I do feel it's now become a sort of real network where you're sort of making links with over the area, and that's really nice.
When did you start?
September 2013. So we've not been going for a huge amount of time, but
has it been growing?
Yes,
as an event.
it has.
Good.
Yeah.
do you think you're going to stick with that format as it is? I'm really interested in that Fen Speak on tour idea. I think it's really nice.
Well, we've got meetings with the Arts Council
Yes.
coming up, so we're going to look into funding and the possibility of expanding or helping to
having maybe workshops, particularly for young people. And other events. I think probably the idea is keeping probably the basic model as it is, but we may have additional ones with a slightly different focus.
Actually, that's just because you mentioned it, it wasn't actually going to be a question, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I run with Lizzy Palmer the Silence Found a Tongue night, which is the launch night for Lunar Poetry, but we've been talking about, hopefully during a half term or something, we'll take a day off work and run a children's open mic or young people's open mic.
Great.
Just because you mentioned it there, Elaine, how important do you think it is that there should be more events like that?
Well, I think it's vital, really, and it takes a lot because I think particularly young people need to have the opportunity to experience live poetry, and as something that's fun to do, and not something that's sort of obscure and difficult or not for them. And if you don't get that when you're younger, then the future poetry is in trouble.
And I think the issue, particularly around the rural areas around Fenland, is that not necessarily that there is poverty itself, but there's poverty of opportunity, and that's something that we really need to sort out.
Yeah.
So.
And I do think it annoys me a bit that poets that run nights as a private affair, which aren't linked to funded programmes by councils and stuff, don't take it upon themselves to offer more opportunities like this to young people, because effectively what happens if the council puts on something, or the local, do the LEA still exist? I don't know, but
not sure.
Anyway, the equivalent, whatever that is now, but local education authority boards, if they're putting on events, then the poets they're going to choose are going to be very safe. They're going to be sort of syllabus based, whereas I think if poets start putting on, if they're linked, if you had a young person's open mic day or night linked to a night that was already running, and you got people down, you just told them, right, no swearing. It's pretty easy to do. You're
absolutely.
Young people, you give young people an opportunity to step up and speak in between.
And I think children can tell when something's being put on in order to improve them, rather than
creative expression.
Exactly.
Did any of you three have opportunities like that when you were younger? I don't know how long you've been writing or reading.
No. See, I've not been writing for very long. I've only been writing since about 2008. So sort of into adulthood was my writing. So at school, I remember poetry being, here is the anthology with the safe poets in, and you just learn the bits that are interesting and tick it off the list.
So. I mean, I started as an actress, and I've been writing and acting sort of since I was a child. So I used to have to learn a lot of poetry, and so I always enjoyed it in that way. But I don't think it was accessible. It's only because I sought it out that it was.
And I think I certainly can't remember there being performance
opportunities.
And I think it's something that needs, if you're to be encouraged to do that, it's a lot of sort of confidence building. It's quite I mean, even with I've been surprised by how very accomplished poets are very nervous about stepping up to the mic. There's been published poets at our nights who have never read their work at an event, which has astonished me. But I'm really, really, really proud that that they felt that it was a good environment to actually start doing that.
In some ways, you feel like in order to get anywhere, you have to be able to read well.
It seems to be the case nowadays, I think, with literary festivals being what they are. You do need to sort of have that edge to you.
Skill,
I think so.
Are we going to talk about that? Because that's a long discussion. Maybe we should leave that. It's a very... I mean, I think generally what you said is not a problem with what you said, but once you start analysing it, it's quite difficult. So rather than that, maybe we'll have a second poem from Elaine.
This poem actually is not set in Fenland, it's set in Cornwall, but I'm reminded of what Poppy said earlier about clergymen going to remote places, because this is a case in point. This poem was based on the life of Robert Stephen Hawker, a 19th century clergyman who had a reputation for being very eccentric, and so he was in this remote parish in Cornwall, where he had permission to be as strange as he pleased. And one of the things that he did, which spoke quite powerfully to me, he lived near the cliffs, a place that was very very dangerous for ships, and when there were shipwrecks, he would go and make sure that the dead from the wrecks were given a Christian burial in his churchyard. So this is Harvest at Morwenstone. All must be safely gathered in. As the villagers push shut their buffeted doors, their vicar, flapping, motley in primrose and purple, zigzags down the cliff path, lurid in the leering false light that jags between the roiling slate clouds and the slant-edged rocks. At this outpost of the eternal, no one is given up for lost. The sky clears, the bell is rung on the hilltop, and the gleanings of the storm, the mortal flotsam, cradled and folded, is sown in the fresh furrow beside the church. For the earth, he reads, bringeth forth fruit of herself. At dusk, he is seen through the vicarage window, writing letters of condolence by the blackbird, who cocks her tail in the hedge, splashing the undergrowth a warm maroon, and tears through the brambles.
Thank you very much. So, sticking with the open mic theme, how important are open mic nights in the development of your own poetry?
Well, for me, they were really important because I was writing for a little while before I ever showed my poetry to anyone, and I was actually trapped into going to an open mic by a friend of mine who signed me up without my knowledge, and I was like, go ahead, that'll be fine. So that was a bit of a traumatic way into it. But it was actually a really wonderful night in Norwich, and from that I realised that it was kind of something that I really loved doing. So yeah. It came out of that, and sort of since going to open mics, you find people who ask you to do featured performances, and opportunities arise from these networks of people at open mics. So I think they're really important in that way.
Well, I was suddenly thrown into the poetry community, and by winning the Fenland Poet Laureates Awards, because I hadn't had anything published before then, and I certainly never read any of it. And then, so the next week, I was then at festivals and so on, doing readings. And for me, I find it's a great way of meeting sort of like-minded people who are interested in poetry and getting that sort of creative energy. And also getting immediate reactions to things that you've written, because it can be quite an isolated life, just sitting writing poems and then sending them off, and then months later you're getting replies, and there is something particular and very immediate about doing live events as a performer, which is really valuable, even if I wouldn't really call myself primarily someone who performs.
Yeah, I think like what you were saying about it being quite isolated, especially if you discuss it with people that are your friends or relatives that aren't poets, and sometimes you get funny feedback when they don't actually know what they're talking about. and then it's quite a relief sometimes to talk to actual poets who say what you can improve or what is good. But it's strange. It took me quite a long time to unite performance and poetry because of acting. I found it completely different performing my own work that you'd written. I found it just completely terrifying. But it took a lot of work to actually work the two together, but it's great. And especially nights like Fen Speak, where people are really supportive. I've been to other nights where it's kind of cliquey and you don't get the same vibe, but with Fen Speak, everyone's really welcoming to each other and supportive. So it's great.
Yeah, so sort of get the impression that all three of you sort of mainly enjoy the open mic scene for the sort of the connection that you get with audiences and other poets, and there's a level of feedback that you wouldn't necessarily get. So rather than, for instance, you wouldn't necessarily use it for developing a particular poem. Would you use it for changing the writing of a poem?
I have done that in the past, definitely. You perform something, and because I try very hard to be funny in my poetry, and sometimes
and you are funny.
Well, bless you. But sometimes you'll write a joke and you'll think this is a brilliant joke. I'll put this in my poem, and then no reaction. So it's nice to have that feedback to then think, well, maybe this is not as great as I thought it was, or vice versa, something that you thought that you've read just because you think that you need some space to fill, and people go, oh, I really enjoyed that poem, and you don't necessarily think that it would have been an enjoyable poem. So it's really interesting to get that feedback from other people, definitely. And
this idea that with Fen Speak, which I definitely saw myself, and I agree that it's a very supportive and warm environment, but do you not feel, and I'm not suggesting for things to go cliquey because that is just rubbish in itself, but do you think there comes a time when you're comfortable with reading in front of people that you need a more critical audience in order to...
I do.
Yeah.
I think it'd be nice to sort of do writing groups as well, as sort of to actually sit down and look at your work and look at some other people's work and analyse it as well. But that's a different thing. I mean, open mics are fun.
Yeah. No, and that's what I mean. I've sort of been thinking about it a lot. Wrote something recently for Lunar Poetry, and it's just this idea whether there is a need for a division where you still have. And actually, a follow-up question. I mean, do you see the performance scene as merely as a place for sort of straight recitals of poetry, or would you like to see it being more experimental? I mean, of course, it can be a combination of the two things, but should you then move into the realms of things being a bit more experimental, then you're asking a bit more of the audience, aren't you? Then rather than...
I think, as Poppy says, that there's different events and environments serve different purposes. So I think that there should be room for experiment, and the chance... Yes, you shouldn't be so... worried about getting something wrong that you don't take risks. But you also need, on the other side of things, somebody who will be able to give a sort of a knowledgeable idea of whether that did work.
I think that the comparison I'd probably make, and I hope this doesn't sound rude because it's not the intention, but I would compare Fen Speak to Poetry Unplugged in London, in that you're, and I think this is a very nice thing that happens, but you're almost more applauded for stand up and reading rather than for whether it's any good or not. It's actually getting up and doing the thing that's being applauded, and whether then there should be another stage. I'm not saying, I don't know if you could combine the two elements, because perhaps you need a stage where it's welcoming, which you already have, but then another space to go only for the people that want to be critiqued.
Well, I think that's it. You've got a mixture of people who go to Fen Speak and who are there for different reasons. Some of them are practice poets, sort of trying out new material, or just turning up at a new night to meet other people. And there's some who really are there for the social occasion, and there's something they wrote a while ago, and
It depends,
and I don't think, and I think in certainly developing an event that was going down a more experimental route would be very valuable. But I think in a sense the Fenland Poet Laureate Awards links in with Fen Speak in that is it is a competition. It's something that people are aiming to win, and so it has a quality element to it, and the person who wins it then has the chance to develop their skills by being involved in other.
Depends what people want from
in other events.
Yeah, sure. Actually, the next question was going to be about the application process for the Poet Laureate. But before we do that, I think we'll take our third poem from Leanne.
Okay. So this is a cover poem, if you will. I was a bit upset that rock stars and musicians could cover other people's songs, but poets couldn't necessarily do that. So I've had a go. And this is called Kubla Khan's Bar and Grill. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately bar and grill decree, where rum the sacred spirit ran in cocktails measureless to man, for it was buy one get one free. Twice 5 miles of dancing floor, with burly bouncers on the door, and here were girls with luminous tans, where blossomed many a streaky flank, and here disgorged from minivans, stag doos, the men the size of tanks. But oh, that well-stocked bar which slanted down the dark club slick with sweat, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ever a KFC was haunted by men who'd not found Nando's yet. And from this nightclub, with a ceaseless turmoil seething, with shouts and groans and loud dramatic heaving, a mighty vomit stream was forced. He battled shots and come off worse. Huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail. He was kicked out then, wan and pale. The sheer amount left us impressed. A barman came to clean the mess. 5 miles we walked with a mazy motion. How long the queue for drinks now ran. The queue for drinks measureless to man. The guy in front requests an ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far deep, drunken voices threatening war. For Dave had spilt the pint of Darren, and Kate had pilfered all his straits, so now his baccy tin was barren, and his confusion turned to hate. A miracle of rare device to order ale that's served with ice. The moron in the DJ booth, in the corner, and in truth he mixed bizarre the beats he laid, and on his subwoofer he played such songs as drove us to the roof. And smoked we there, twixt bins and seagulls, our shoes stuck fast in unknown brine. We watched flesh push through ruptured hulls of frocks now stained with tears and wine. And look, the local lech is here, his arms are like an octopus's, and look, he's had 6 pints of beer. The girls all cry, beware, beware, his wandering hands, his creepy stare. Weave a circle round him too, and close your eyes in holy dread, for he has on Sambuca fed, and drunk the milk of Malibu.
Thank you very much. I like that. So now I'd like to talk about the application process involved with being selected as Fenland Poet Laureate. And for the benefit of listeners, the criteria are that you must live, work or study in Fenland, and applicants must submit a Fen-related poem of no more than 40 lines typed onto one side of A4 paper. Now this podcast will be going out too late for the 2015 application, but you can find out more information about the whole process and next year's application and who indeed wins this year on the website, which is
it's atelier-east.co.uk,
and we'll put that on the blog and on Facebook and all the Twitter they're in. What I'm wondering is the application process. Do you think could it be considered too restrictive or too blinkered in that it's a very small selection or a very small example of one person's work?
Well, I think
just based on reading those criteria. That's all.
It's one thing that I think every year is a poem about Fenland. Oh, the new things to say about Fenland every year, but it always turns out that there are. Yes, I think it is inevitably, but I think partly, it's the idea is that it's open to everybody. So even people who have not got a body of work,
Yes.
If they happen to write a great poem, then they then have that opportunity. And also practical considerations. We're on a shoestring budget.
Yeah.
The people are running it are not paid, and so we have to have something that's doable. That the time
we can't go reading pamphlets.
We can't. Yes,
Yeah,
and it's free. Of course, it's free to enter, which is
my
part
question
of the
wasn't
inclusiveness.
supposed to be accusatory. It
No,
was supposed to give you a chance to. Absolutely,
I'm sorry.
I wasn't reading anything into your tone. Then I just meant it's good sometimes to have a chance to explain these things, because people assume sometimes that you have an office and there's like 10 or 15 of you reading something.
Yes,
it is just me and Elaine.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's good to explain that the whole thing's only been 3 years, so you're
Yes.
free Fenland Poet Laureates are sitting in the room
So there's
with me now.
plenty of things that we could do to develop it, but I think also just keeping it going each year and
It's
making sure we've
in
always
itself.
got, because once you've got the Fenland Poet Laureate,
We're
everyone so
expanding.
far,
Yeah.
yes, they go and do their thing.
I
And
think the reason I brought it up is because regardless of whether people know what it is to be Fenland Poet Laureate, people sort of have an idea of what the title Poet Laureate means, and sort of would probably assume it's got a long tradition
yes,
anyway because of the title. So do you feel that and of course I don't mean for you to have to commit to anything now, but do you see it as the application process is changing over time, or are you happy with the way it continues to run like that?
We're certainly open to changing if that's possible, and I mean if there's room both practically and
yes.
yeah.
I think that's something that we'll be discussing with potential funders to try to develop it.
Yes.
Really, I think this is a starting point.
Yeah.
And what I think we need to, I think one of the things we need to do, as I said earlier, is also develop because as well as the adult Fenland Poet Laureate, there's also a young Fenland Poet Laureate, and that's something that really does need to be developed.
And we're hoping to be able to, I believe, was it the first year when it was with another arts organisation for the first year, and I believe that they went into schools. Is that right?
I'm not sure that they did, but I think the more funding you have, the more things you're then able to do. So have workshops, go into schools and build those relationships to enable it to develop.
And have there been, well, maybe there hasn't been anything, but what impact on your poetry careers has there been since being?
Well, loads.
Yeah.
I think people definitely take it seriously, the title, and just all of a sudden you just get invited to places and get paid for things sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's really great, and it gives you the confidence to be able to think, actually, I can do this professionally if that's ever possible for anyone.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I might start calling myself the podcast laureate.
It's a great feeling to say it as well.
Yeah.
Definitely. The thing is, it's not the title itself that does it. A lot of it is the hard work that you put in behind it as well.
You have to
The
network,
title
definitely.
really
I'm not
does
interested,
help. Yeah, I mean, I've been invited to do things at the Royal Albert Hall and Festival, and I feel like it's all off the back of having that title and having had that year and those opportunities to sort of push forward.
You do. I mean, it's a combination between sort of having the sort of network set up and you're doing your work to, even though I know it sounds terrible, but network and make contact and put yourself out there. But I think having that title and be able to say I'm Fenland Poet Laureate gives you the confidence to say, yes, I can come into your school and talk about whatever.
Yeah,
yes,
definitely.
And it is for people that do want to be poets.
Yes.
So
Yes.
we do have that thing of pushing ourselves forward anyway in our careers, I suppose, because we want to do it.
Hard work and all that. This is what's going on. Anyway, so we're just going to move on to the two final questions, which are the same as always. And we'll go round once with the first one and then again with the second. If you could give us some of the influences over your writing and performing? And they don't necessarily have to be poets. They can be...
Oh gosh, so I'm more at the performance end. So people like Kate Tempest, Holly McNish, John Cooper Clarke, Benjamin Zephaniah. That sort of those people are more my influence than perhaps the traditional poets. Yeah.
One particular poet who has been a great influence on me is the Scottish poet Kathleen Jamie. I think she hates being called a nature poet, but she has written a lot about relationship with the environment and the work of attention in just seeing beyond, the surface.
I've always been influenced by the Romantic poets, Blake, Shelley, Wordsworth, Keats. But I love the sound of words as well. So Dylan Thomas, people like that, and Yeats as well have really influenced me. And I love the way Dylan Thomas talks about place, and with such... I can't even think of the word. It's a pleasure to listen to, even if you don't understand it.
Yeah. It's nice when people say proper poets' names on it. It doesn't happen often. Not that your answers are wrong, it's just it doesn't happen very often. And then we'll probably go back the other way again. For the benefit of the listeners, I'm pointing around the room. Is there anything that you would recommend to our listeners to see or watch or go and listen? Anything?
There's definitely a lot of brilliant poets at the moment. Helen Mort, who did your last podcast, I'm a big fan of hers. I got her book for Christmas.
Yes.
I think she's brilliant. Sally Jenkinson as well. But there's also a lot of great shows. Like, poets are now creating shows out of their own work, adding an extra thing to it, and brilliant things to see.
Well, I do sort of read some various things. But something I've been really looking at the moment is Anne Carlson's translation of Sappho, If Not Winter, which I'm just fascinated by the idea of fragments and the way that when Sappho originally wrote the poem, it's now a completely different poem to the one that we're now reading in its fragmented form.
So the West Midlands poet Liz Berry, I think, is very, very good at the moment. So definitely go to see her or read her work if you can. Boom.
Right. Yeah, so that's the end. That's Lunar Poetry Podcast number 5. I'll just thank once more Papa Kleiser, Elaine Ewart and Leanne Moden, and links to their Twitter pages, any blogs, any interesting websites will be up on the Lunar Poetry blog